Hi, everyone. Thanks for checking out my video today. I'm going to let you guys into a very brief glimpse of what I did over the last year at the Department of Psychology, along with Professor Yana Thomas. Now, we do research on eyewitness testimonies and seeing different ways that we can improve participants' recollection of an original event, and what other factors may cause them to be more susceptible to misinformation. Now, it's important to study this subject because eyewitness testimonies have been historically not the most reliable tool to use in judicial settings and other settings. And in fact, the Time investigation found that 166 convictions were overturned in 2016. Some that were convicted as far back as 1964. So these people have spent over 40 years wrongly convicted in jail. And that's an average of 3 exonerations per week, which is for the whole 52 weeks of a year, which is a lot. And it is already double the rate of 2011. Now, it's important to note that while this is, partly caused by improvements in DNA technology and improved prosecutorial protocols, there is evidence that suggests that 70% of these exonerations were originally convicted off few or even just one misleading eyewitness testimony, which does suggest that humans aren't as reliable tools to use for testimonies, and that there needs to be more research done to see what the true nature of our abilities are. Now, we try to replicate an eyewitness scenario as closely as we can in a lab, and this usually follows the following. This usually follows the following scenario. Now, participants witness an original event. They'll then recall what they just saw by dialing 911 or calling a friend, a family member, texting a friend, a family member, whatever. After a period of time, they'll then be exposed to information from family members, from news, from social media that may or may not contradict what they saw in the original video. After a period of time, if they're needed in a couple of days or weeks, they'll be interviewed by police. They'll get your details down, what you saw. And even after a further period of time, let's say months or even years, you might be even called to give your own testimony. Now, researchers have been trying to see what factors we can use, what different manipulations we can use to improve participants' accuracy of their original memory, and ways that we can inhibit new information from being introduced in these scenarios. Now, previous research has found that warning participants before this exposure to information can improve their accuracy and misinformation susceptibility. And it can just be in a short verbal form of like, oh, the information you're about to see might not be the most accurate. So in future opportunities, just try to base your answers, try to base your responses on what you remember from, an event or a video or whatever. Now, there's other research that suggests that people who were tested before post-event information take a little bit longer to process that information once they read it slower, compared to people who didn't dial 911 or weren't tested initially after seeing an event. And there's in the same study, there's other research there's other data that suggests that when exposed to misleading information, it will take longer to process it than information that was consistent, and even longer than information that was totally neutral or wasn't too descriptive. Now, my experiment design tries to replicate this, the eyewitness scenario of witnessing an event, calling 911, this and that, and tries to see whether warnings are effective at improving accuracy and misinformation susceptibility, and how this may affect participants' attention in terms of how long they take to process and read things when they're exposed to this post-event information. And it'll follow the general design of having participants watch a video that simulates watching an original event, and we chose a very short clip from an old movie that depicts a very methodical crime scene. Participants will then be subject to a 21-question test based on 21 different items that we manipulated in the post-event information narrative. Participants will then do a filler task, which is 10 minutes of Sudoku, in order to let all these memories consolidate and get properly stored in their head. They'll then read a narrative, and all participants will be exposed to will be exposed equally to consistent, neutral, and misleading information. And I'll explain a little bit what that is in the next slide. Half of participants will receive a pre-warning prior to this narrative. As I said before, it's just a quick verbal instruction that says, hey, the information that you're going to read ahead might not be the most accurate. So, try to base your answers in the future based on, your original memories. Participants will then be asked to do the test again to see if this had any effect. And they'll finally be asked to fill out a discrepancy recollection task, which basically goes through the same questions a third time and ask them, hey, did you notice any discrepancy when you read the narrative? Did you have two possible answers in mind when you were answering this question, or was it just one? And in order to expand on the different types of manipulations that we'll use for the information, take, for example, the following screenshot of the video we use. Now, there's a Coca-Cola machine, as you can see on the other side of this subway car. And so a consistent sentence would just say what it is. The man stood in front of the Coca-Cola vending machine. Now, a neutral sentence, or what we call a control sentence, will have no descriptive information. And so it'll just say the man stood in front of a soda vending machine. And then finally, the third way that will manipulate a sentence is by saying something that's objectively wrong, and we'll say something to the effect of the man stood in front of a Dr. Pepper machine, which is misinformation and it is not what happened in the video. And so let's take a look at our results. We saw that participants had higher accuracy on questions that they read consistent items on, and lower accuracy on misleading items, which means that reading misleading items does have a negative effect on participants' accuracy. And we also saw that a pre-warning, warning participants prior to reading this information, does significantly improve their accuracy on misleading trials. While it doesn't completely improve their performance, there is a significant decrease. There is a significant increase in performance when participants are warned. We then look at misinformation susceptibility. That is, at what rate do participants report saying, it was Dr. Pepper instead of Coca-Cola? And when participants are warned, we do see a lowering of this incidence of misinformation susceptibility. And so participants go from reporting misinformation 52% of the time if they're not warned to only reporting it 36% of the time if they are warned. This does suggest that while warnings aren't completely effective at preventing participants from being susceptible to misinformation, it does reduce it significantly, from 52 to 36%. And then in terms of accuracy, participants, are overconfident in both conditions. 75 out of 100 when they're not warned, but only 64 out of 100 when they are warned. So again, participants are generally overconfident and they are susceptible to misinformation. This only tells us that warnings are effective at reducing this effect somewhat. We then looked at reading times between these consistent, controlled, and misleading sentences, and we didn't observe a systematic difference between reading times on warning conditions. So that would be the orange and blue bars. They're, statistically about the same on each condition, which suggests that participants, a pre-warning does not affect participants' reading time. But we did see a difference between consistent and misleading reading times over control reading times, which suggests that there is a little bit of a slower reading time for consistent and misleading trials, indicating that any presence of extra information causes participants to take a little bit longer to process this information. Finally, we did see that warning participants does significantly increase their ability to recollect any discrepancies, and that pre-warnings are effective at getting participants to remember these discrepancies after they've filled out the last test. Now, the implications of this data are that pre-warnings are effective at increasing accuracy and reducing misinformation when exposed to misinformation. And in simple terms, it's effective at making participants more right about their answers, and that's about it. And reducing misinformation, it's not a perfect measure; it just improves their performance. That's all what this data says. Now, but pre-warnings are also effective at making participants far less overconfident on answers where they produce misinformation. That bit between 75 and 64. Again, participants are still overconfident because it should be 0. But any decrease gives us a good indication that pre-warnings make participants more doubtful of their answers. Pre-warnings are also make participants more likely to remember discrepancies, which is useful as they're being tested, because this indicates that pre-warnings are making participants a little bit more aware of the fact that they read misleading information and they recall it. So all of this indicates that pre-warnings seem to have a stronger effect on retrieval processes rather than encoding processes. What this means is that we thought that pre-warnings would get participants to read slower and to have improved performance and improved discrepancy recollection abilities. That being said, we did see improvement in performance. We saw an improvement in discrepancy recollection, but we didn't see a difference in reading time, suggesting that pre-warnings seem to have a stronger interaction when participants remember the answers instead of when they encode the answers. And this is valuable information when you want to design police protocols on how to improve eyewitness reliability, or even in the school setting when you want to make sure that kids are learning information in the classroom and that they're not going out and learning extra information and misinformation on social media or from friends, which could potentially difficult their learning. And yeah, that's my presentation. If anyone has any questions about what my method was and would generally just like me to explain things a little bit more, feel free to email me at my email up top. I would also like to offer my sincerest gratitude to Alia Wolf, my graduate supervisor for the last 2 years, and Professor Ayana Thomas. I would like to thank Professor Elizabeth Race for being part of my defense thesis and helping me out over the last week in getting my defense done. And I would also like to thank the Summer Scholars Program for funding this opportunity for the last year for me. And thank you very much, and hope you enjoy the rest of the undergraduate symposium.